Hello guys, welcome to another video, and in this one I'm going to be talking a little bit about armor and other ways to mitigate physical damage, because armor has been a very big topic recently. I'm sure some of you have seen Crypt's videos on armor, where he's been discussing a lot of things about how armor works in PoE 2 and why it's fairly ineffective, especially against bosses, and in those videos Crypt brings up a lot of good points. But in this video I kind of want to cover what I'm doing to deal with physical damage, and also kind of discuss the broader topic. So, let's just get straight into it and discuss what I'm doing with physical damage on this particular build that I'm playing here. I'm using Cloak of Flame, and I'm also playing Solo Self-Found. This is an item that I dropped really early on, and I was using it from the point where I had basically no armor. And I've decided over time that Cloak of Flame simply is better than scaling armor, because it's very difficult to get a good amount of armor in Path of Exile 2. But this was before I even realised that armor is possibly a lot worse in PoE 2, and there's been a bit of recent testing done on Reddit. There's a thread that come up by Blue.55, and in that topic they are discussing how armor functions in Path of Exile 2. They've been doing testing with what looks like a fairly solid method there to be able to kind of test the armor formula, and they've come to the conclusion that armor is significantly weaker in Path of Exile 2 in terms of how much damage it mitigates. Approximately, you'll need 2.4 times the armor value that you needed in PoE 1 to be able to mitigate the same amount of damage. Now, this formula, I haven't been able to actually test it myself, and I haven't been able to confirm with anybody else if this is actually accurate, but this is what we've got going on right now. This looks like to be a solid method of testing, and so I'm just going to take this at face value for what it is, and I think that this is probably fairly correct. It might be slightly out, but from my own personal gameplay revolving around armor, I found it to be quite weak. So with armor being worse than it is in PoE 1, and the fact that you can't get as much armor in PoE 2, at least not without ridiculous amounts of investment, that leaves armor in a bit of a weird place. It's still somewhat good for mitigating small hits. If you stack a lot of armor, and by a lot I mean, somewhere in the region of 10 to 15,000 in PoE 2, well, when you get hit by a lot of small hits and you're able to, mitigate those hits by maybe 80 to 90% each, that's going to be very good. That's going to be a good time. You're going to be able to recover that damage back, and there's not really going to be too many problems. It's when you start taking those bigger hits and your armor completely gets crushed, because, the way our armor works is that it's much more effective against smaller hits and much weaker against bigger hits. So as that damage creeps up, and especially as you go through into higher maps and as you start bossing and you start to do pinnacle bosses and things like that, you'll find that armor becomes really, really weak. And one of the reasons that it's especially weak in PoE 2 is that there are almost no ways to scale additional physical damage reduction, which is a stat that stacks additively with armor's physical damage reduction to provide a final value of reduction for the damage coming in from a hit. What I've been doing ever since I dropped this Cloak of Flame is I've been using this item, and I haven't really looked back. So Cloak of Flame has a very important modifier, 40% of physical damage taken as fire damage. What that does is, whenever you take physical damage, 40% of that is taken as fire damage instead, and it doesn't matter if it's a hit or damage over time for the purpose of this specific modifier, which makes it pretty good against physical damage over time as well. But we're not really interested in physical damage over time for this video, we're just interested in hit damage and comparing this to armor. So, the build that I've gone for, and the kind of thing that I've been focusing on doing, is using Cloak of Flame and then trying to stack a lot of fire resistance. On this build, I've reached 90% fire resistance, and what that means is that not only am I extremely strong against any incoming fire damage, but I'm also able to massively improve my physical mitigation by scaling fire resistance because of this modifier on here. So, one of the main reasons that I'm doing this is because of a specific node on the passive tree. So let's head over to the passive tree and actually take a look at that. It's called Heatproofing. So Heatproofing will apply 25% of your armor to fire damage taken from hits. And what that means is that 25% of your armor will be applied to the fire damage after it's already been mitigated by fire resistance, which means that it's going to be extremely effective at further mitigating that damage down to almost nothing. So how am I stacking 90% fire resistance? Well, actually, it's quite trivial to get a lot of maximum fire resistance because of how the tree is set up on the warrior's side and also because of some really strong unique items. Firstly, there is the Rise of the Phoenix, which I'm not using in this build, but if you were to be using a one-hander and a shield, or for example a two-hander and a shield if you're using Giant's Blood, you could use Rise of the Phoenix, which provides 5% to maximum fire resistance. That's one way to get a big chunk of that stat. But I'm using the Belt Inferno clasp for plus 5% to maximum fire resistance. So this is already a third of the way, going from 75% to 90%. Now, the rest of my maximum fire resistance scaling, which is the last 10%, is coming from the passive skill tree. So let's head over to the passive skill tree and take a look how we're getting that. Firstly, we're pathing over here on the back side of the tree, all the way up to Prism Guard, and taking these two small nodes plus Prism Guard, that's 3% to maximum fire resistance there. And then over here on the tree is the more important part, which is where the other 7% is coming from. So 1% comes from this small node here. And then we have Unnatural Resilience, which is plus 2% to maximum fire resistance for each 40% uncapped fire resistance. And uncapped resistance is anything above 0. And you can see right here in the brackets we have exactly 120%, which means we're gaining 6% maximum from this node, for a total of exactly 90% fire resistance. So with 90% fire resistance, we're able to mitigate a ridiculous amount of fire damage whenever we get hit. And the thing is, it doesn't stop at 90% mitigation, because the way our armor works when it's being applied to elemental damage or to chaos damage is that it's applied after resistance mitigation happens, and it's applied on a separate layer, which is not capped by resistance. So firstly, we're mitigating fire damage by 90%, and then we're mitigating it again by 25% of our armor. So how exactly does that work? Well, let's go through an example of how my setup works when I take a large amount of physical damage. Let's say 3,000 physical damage, and just for, simplicity's sake, let's say that I have 3,300 armor. So 1,200 of that 3,000 physical damage is taken as fire damage, which is first mitigated by the 90% fire resistance down to just 120 fire damage. And then it's mitigated by heatproofing. So 25% of armor is applied to that hit, and that's 825 armor being applied to the 120 damage, which would provide 36% damage reduction, bringing the damage down further to just 77 fire damage. Then the remaining 60% of the hit is taken normally as physical damage. So 1,800 physical damage is mitigated by 3,300 armor, which provides 13% physical damage reduction, bringing the damage down to 1,566. So 1,566 physical damage is taken and 77 fire damage is taken, for a total of 1,643 damage. That means that around 45% of the damage was mitigated using this setup with Cloak of Flame and Heatproofing, stacking maximum fire resistance. Now, here's the crazy thing about that. To mitigate 45% of a 3,000 physical damage hit with just armor alone, you'd need 30,000 armor if the new calculated formula on the Reddit thread is correct. So 30,000 armor is absolutely ridiculous. Even with extremely good gear, that's very, very hard to achieve. And at that point, you'd be completely over-invested into armor. You wouldn't really be able to spec much else. And even then, you are really, really vulnerable to physical overwhelm, which we know exists in the game, and some boss abilities actually have physical overwhelm attached to them, and that's just going to completely crush your physical damage reduction by a huge percentage. We know that some boss abilities have 30% on this stat, so you can imagine, if you come to mitigating a 3,000 physical damage hit and you get crushed for 30%, you're only going to be mitigating 15% of that, even if you had 30,000 armor, which you're probably going to end up dead shortly after that hit's taken. Now, one thing that's important to mention, of course, is that armor is still quite effective at mitigating very small hits. Even if you're using Cloak of Flame, stacking armor would be more effective against many small hits. But the chances of you dying against many small physical hits is quite unlikely, and I think it's those very large hits that take you from 100 to 0 are the ones that are going to kill you, and so, being more effective at mitigating that kind of damage is a better idea overall. And there's something else to mention as well about this whole kind of armor problem that's sprouted up in the last few days that people have been discussing a lot, and that's that really, the balance isn't all there. It's not just armor. Armor isn't the only problem. It's also life and energy shield as the kind of two big outliers there. You've got energy shield that is fairly trivial to scale past, 5,000, 6,000, even approaching 10,000 and above. And then you have life, which is very hard to scale even past 4,000 or 4,500. Now, in terms of actual damage taken, life and energy shield are pretty much identical, other than the fact that energy shield takes double damage, or I should say it removes twice as much of the resource when you're taking chaos damage. Naturally, the most effective thing to do in this game right now, in terms of the current balance, is to simply stack energy shield, because it's completely overtuned. It incentivizes you to just stack insane amounts of energy shield, and so that you can completely forgo investing into any additional defenses on top of that, because you're then able to get so much energy shield as your effective life ball that you essentially outgear any monster damage at that point, and they cannot deal enough damage to kill you unless you take a bunch of abilities together. Hopefully, GGG is going to address this problem when they return from their break, but as of right now, this strategy using Cloak of Flame is simply the most effective way at mitigating physical damage, and it's not even close.